To the world, he is an untouchable musical deity, celebrated with state-sanctioned glory. Yet, hidden within the shadows of his legacy is a marginalized architect, his 23-year-old wife, whom he admitted to physically abusing. Why did the industry fiercely protect his sanitized myth, while her pivotal contributions were nearly erased from history? This is the complex story of Miles and Betty Davis, a dynamic that birthed a sonic revolution, followed by the systemic marginalization of the woman who sparked it. The year is 1968, and the ground beneath the American music industry is violently shifting. Miles Davis is 42 years old. To the outside world, he is an untouchable deity. He is the architect of Kind of Blue, the undisputed king of the cool aesthetic, moving through the world in sharp, custom-tailored Italian suits and driving imported Ferraris. He possesses an aura of supreme, almost terrifying arrogance. But many biographers and cultural historians point out a hidden reality beneath that polished armor. By 1968, Miles Davis is a man consumed by the terrifying psychological dread of becoming obsolete. Jazz, the kingdom he ruled, is dying a slow, suffocating death in small, half-empty clubs. The cultural epicenter has moved. The youth are not listening to acoustic quintets. They are tearing the world apart to the electric, distorted, sweat-soaked sounds of rock and funk. Jimi Hendrix is setting his guitar on fire at Monterey. Sly and the Family Stone are creating psychedelic funk anthems that sound like the future. Miles Davis looks out at this new world and realizes he is standing on the wrong side of history. His fatal weakness, his hamartia, is a monstrous, ravenous ego that cannot tolerate being second to anyone, combined with a crippling insecurity that he no longer knows how to lead. He is a king trapped in a crumbling castle, desperate for a map to the outside world. And then she walks in. Her name is Betty Mabry. She is 23 years old, raised in the Steeltown grit of Pittsburgh, but operating at the absolute bleeding edge of the New York underground. It is crucial to immediately dismantle the narrative that Columbia Records would later spend millions of dollars trying to sell you. Betty Mabry was not a naive groupie. She was not a starry-eyed model looking for a famous man to validate her existence. Long before she ever crossed paths with Miles Davis, Betty was an architect of the scene. She had enrolled at the Fashion Institute of Technology. She was managing the Cellar, an exclusive, hyper-trendy club in Manhattan where the rock and soul royalty convened. She was a songwriter, having already penned the hit Uptown for the Chambers Brothers. She had her own money, her own fiercely independent identity, and most importantly, she possessed the exact cultural currency that Miles Davis was desperately lacking. She was friends with Jimi Hendrix. She knew Sly Stone. She was living, breathing the counterculture that Miles was only observing from a safe, sterile distance. When they meet in 1968, the physical and psychological magnetism is instantaneous, but the power dynamic is incredibly complex. On paper, it looks like a classic cliche: the wealthy, older, established male genius and the beautiful younger woman. But the reality is a complete inversion of cultural power. Miles has the money and the institutional backing, but Betty holds the keys to his survival. He looks at her and sees a terrifyingly free spirit. She wears thigh-high leather boots, sports a massive afro, and speaks with a raw, unvarnished confidence that completely ignores the traditional hierarchies of the jazz world. She's not intimidated by him. While older musicians treat Miles with fearful reverence, Betty challenges him. She looks at his impeccable conservative suits and tells him they belong in a museum. She looks at his music and tells him he needs to plug in. For Miles, this attraction is fatal. He is drawn to her energy like a starving man to a feast. He falls deeply, obsessively in love with her. But it is a love heavily laced with the desire for extraction. He needs her youth. He needs her vision. But a man whose entire identity is built on being the smartest, most innovative person in any room cannot easily swallow the fact that his 23-year-old girlfriend is suddenly his teacher. This drama-filled contradiction, his absolute reliance on her cultural compass versus his narcissistic need to be the sole author of his own greatness, plants the seeds of a profound tragedy. They marry quickly in September 1968, and this is where the machinery of the music industry really gets dirty. The executive suites at Columbia Records, then steered by powerful men like Clive Davis, are in the business of selling mythologies. They have invested heavily in the mythology of Miles Davis as an isolated, brooding genius. He is their premium product. When Miles suddenly marries a young, wildly radical, deeply connected woman who begins fundamentally altering his appearance and his sound, the label faces a narrative crisis. They cannot market a Miles Davis who is taking creative orders from a woman half his age. The institutional racism and deeply entrenched misogyny of the late 1960s corporate music structure simply will not allow it. A black woman in 1968 is expected to be polite, polished, and deferential. Betty is aggressive, sexually dominant, and loud. She is a threat to the established order. So the system engages in its first act of absolute complicity. The systematic erasure of Betty. Many cultural historians argue that the systemic bias of the era allowed her contributions to be easily marginalized. The PR machine, aided by a compliant mainstream press, consistently boxed her into the patronizing trope of the muse. Rather than acknowledging her as an independent creative force, the industry naturally deferred the intellectual credit to their star asset. This was not an accident. It was a deeply ingrained systemic reflex. The industry was structurally incapable of admitting that their 43-year-old jazz king was dependent on the cultural compass of a young black woman. To acknowledge her contribution would be to dilute his absolute authority. And in the business of selling records, absolute authority is what drives the mythology. This systematic theft set the stage for a devastating psychological collapse within the walls of their home. The financial and critical triumph of Bitches Brew did not bring peace to the marriage. It acted as an accelerant to the toxic dynamic already brewing between them. This precise dynamic triggered the fatal flaw, the hamartia, that would ultimately destroy the relationship and leave permanent scars on Betty's life. Miles Davis was a man trapped in a profound ego-driven contradiction. On a deep subconscious level, he knew exactly how much he owed to his wife. He knew that without her, he would likely still be playing aging standards in half-empty clubs, but his narcissism could not process that debt. Instead of gratitude, his reliance on her mutated into a suffocating paranoid resentment. He was receiving the adoration of the world for a transformation she had engineered, and the guilt of that stolen valor turned him into a monster. His insecurity began to manifest as a desperate need for absolute control. He could control the musicians in his studio, but he could not control Betty. She remained vibrantly independent. She continued to write her own music. She continued to move through the underground scene with effortless charisma, and she continued to maintain her high-profile friendships. It was her relationship with Jimi Hendrix that pushed Miles's paranoia past the point of no return. Hendrix and Betty shared a natural, unforced understanding of the world. They were peers in age and peers in their radical approach to culture. Miles, watching them interact, felt the crushing weight of his own age and his own manufactured relevance. His mind, fueled by insecurity and a deeply entrenched patriarchal possessiveness, began to construct elaborate narratives of betrayal. Many historians and biographers have debated the nature of Betty's relationship with Jimi Hendrix. The prevailing historical consensus, supported by Betty's own lifelong assertions and the lack of any concrete evidence, is that they were close friends and kindred artistic spirits, nothing more. But in the theater of Miles Davis's mind, the truth was irrelevant. The mere possibility that his young, brilliant wife could be attracted to a man who was his contemporary rival was enough to shatter his fragile reality. He convinced himself that they were having an affair. His insecurity manifested in toxic and destructive ways. In his own autobiography, Miles Davis confessed to physically striking his wife out of jealousy. The genius the world worshipped was, behind closed doors, a man whose need for control had devolved into undeniable domestic abuse. But the true tragedy of this story is not merely the violence itself, it is the chilling, calculated silence of the system that surrounded them. This is where the prosecution points its finger directly at the machinery of the music industry. The abuse happening inside that marriage was not a perfectly kept secret. The music business is a notoriously small, interconnected world. The managers, the producers, the PR representatives, and the high-level executives at Columbia Records had access to Miles Davis's life. They saw the volatility. They saw the bruised dynamics. They heard the rumors. And in some cases, they saw the physical evidence of the hostility. Yet the collective response of the entire corporate structure was to look the other way. This chilling silence was a direct product of the corporate arithmetic of the early 1970s. Columbia Records was not in the business of morality. They were in the business of selling vinyl. Miles Davis was no longer just a respected jazz musician. In the wake of Bitches Brew, he was a primary economic engine. He was a multi-million-dollar asset. The executives recognized that their asset was engaging in horrific domestic abuse, but they made a calculated, cold-blooded decision. The preservation of the product was more important than the safety of the woman. In the elite circles of the recording industry, there was a deeply toxic, unspoken rule regarding artistic temperament. Monstrous behavior, abuse, and cruelty were routinely dismissed as the necessary side effects of genius. The system actively insulated its stars from the consequences of their actions. The executives at Columbia did not just fail to protect Betty Davis, they actively enabled her abuser by ensuring his reputation remained pristine. They provided a financial and structural fortress around Miles, allowing him to operate with total impunity. If a scandal threatened to break, the PR machine was ready to suffocate it. If Betty had tried to speak out during that time, who would have listened? She was a 20-something black woman up against a billion-dollar corporate behemoth. that had already successfully convinced the world she was nothing more than an eccentric groupie. The power imbalance was staggering. The industry executives looked at Betty Davis and decided she was entirely disposable. Her pain was simply the cost of doing business, an acceptable collateral damage in the maintenance of the Miles Davis mythology. This absolute complicity by the institutions of power is the darkest chapter of their story. It reveals a terrifying truth about how history is curated. We are taught to revere the great men of the past, to separate the art from the artist. But what the system demands we ignore is that the art itself is often built on the stolen labor and silenced trauma of the people the artist crushed along the way. Betty Davis gave the music industry its most profitable revolution in a decade, and in return, the industry held the door closed while she was beaten. They watched her husband extract every ounce of her creative capital, and when he turned violent, they protected the thief and abandoned the victim. But if the industry and Miles Davis believed that this violence and systemic erasure would break her, they fundamentally misunderstood the woman they were dealing with. Betty Davis was not engineered to be a victim. As the marriage descended into an intolerable nightmare of control and abuse, she made a decision that would alter the trajectory of her life and secure her legacy as a pioneer. She realized that she could not survive within the suffocating gravity of Miles Davis's ego, and she certainly could not rely on a music industry that viewed her as expendable. In 1970, after barely a year of marriage, she packed her things, walked out of the townhouse, and filed for divorce. She left the money, she left the institutional protection, and she left the man who had stolen her cultural blueprint. She stepped out into the void, entirely alone, determined to prove that the genius they had attributed to him had actually belonged to her all along. The rebellion of Betty Davis was about to begin, and the system, terrified of an uncontrollable independent woman, was preparing its most brutal campaign of punishment yet. The moment the townhouse door clicked shut behind her in 1970, the industry assumed Betty Davis would simply vanish into the historical footnotes as another discarded muse. She had walked away from the wealth, the institutional protection, and the blinding aura of the most famous jazz musician on the planet. For a woman in her mid-20s with no formal label backing and a reputation entirely dictated by her ex-husband's PR machine, stepping into the void should have been a death sentence for her career. The executives at Columbia Records certainly thought so. They had successfully stripped her of her intellectual credit for the aesthetic revolution of the late 1960s, and they fully expected her to quietly retreat into the shadows, allowing the mythology of the solitary male genius to remain entirely undisturbed. But they had profoundly miscalculated the sheer terrifying force of her artistic will. Betty Davis did not leave that abusive marriage to disappear. She left to declare war. The system that had colluded to erase her identity and protect her abuser was about to face a musical rebellion so fierce, so unapologetically raw, that it would require a coordinated industry-wide effort to eventually silence her. To rebuild her shattered identity, she had to leave the suffocating gravity of New York and the jazz establishment that had treated her as an exotic accessory. She moved to London, a city vibrating with the theatrical, gender-bending energy of the glam rock movement. There she fell in with a different breed of revolutionaries, striking up a close friendship with Mark Bolan of T-Rex. She absorbed the visual audacity of the UK scene, the heavy stomping rhythms, and the absolute refusal to adhere to traditional boundaries of fashion and sound. She was taking notes, amalgamating the heavy funk she had pioneered with Miles, and injecting it with the theatrical, aggressive posture of rock and roll. When she finally returned to the United States, relocating to the West Coast, she was no longer the silent girl on the cover of a jazz record. She was a fully formed, independent architect, ready to build her own empire. She did not seek out a major label immediately, knowing that the corporate structure would immediately try to sanitize her. Instead, she secured a deal with a small independent imprint called Just Sunshine Records, run by Michael Lang, the co-creator of Woodstock. It was a crucial strategic move. She demanded and received absolute creative control. In 1973, Betty Davis walked into the recording studio to create her debut album. She was the sole writer and arranger of the project, a radical assertion of control in an era when black women were often expected to be pliable vocalists. While Greg Errico, the drummer for Sly and the Family Stone, served as the producer for this first record, Betty's creative dominance was undeniable. By her second album, They Say I'm Different, 1974, she would officially take over sole production duties as well. The audacity of this move cannot be overstated. Picture the scene in the San Francisco recording studio. She had assembled a lethal rhythm section, recruiting members of Sly and the Family Stone, including bassist Larry Graham and drummer Greg Errico, alongside the Neil Schon from Santana and the Pointer Sisters on backing vocals. These were some of the most hardened, experienced, and brilliant session musicians in the world, men who were accustomed to taking orders from legendary producers and standing at the center of the room, dictating the tempo, demanding heavier bass lines, and orchestrating the exact distortion of the guitars, was a 28-year-old black woman who refused to compromise a single note. She was not asking for their permission to lead. She was commanding it. The music they recorded during those sessions was not jazz, and it was not the polished, church-inflected soul of Aretha Franklin or the glossy pop of Diana Ross. It was something entirely alien and deeply intimidating. It was hard, metallic, blistering funk. It was the sound of a woman violently breaking out of a cage. When her self-titled debut album, Betty Davis, was released in 1973, it acted as a psychological shockwave. The cover art alone was a declaration of total independence. She stood tall, sporting a massive, glorious afro, wearing thigh-high silver platform boots, a studded choker, and an expression of absolute predatory confidence. The woman who had been beaten by her husband for her independence was now broadcasting her physical and sexual power to the entire world. But it was the music that truly terrified the establishment. From the opening notes of the track, If I'm in Luck, I Might Get Picked Up, she dismantled every societal expectation placed upon women. She did not sing about waiting for a man to love her. She did not sing about heartbreak or domestic devotion. She sang about aggressively hunting for physical pleasure, reversing the traditional gender roles of the predator and the prey. She prowled through the rhythm, her voice not seeking the clean melodic perfection of standard R&B, but rather growling, shrieking, purring, and shouting, Her vocal delivery was a physical assault on the microphone. She was using her voice the way Jimi Hendrix used his guitar, bending it, distorting it, and pushing it to the absolute limit of its emotional capacity. The industry did not know what to do with her. The complicity of the music business is not always found in active violence. Sometimes it is found in the deliberate categorization of art to marginalize it. The major radio networks, largely controlled by conservative white executives, took one listen to the aggressive, sexually dominant nature of her music and panicked. They could not fit her into the soul category, and she was far too black for the rock category. They weaponized the concept of obscenity against her. Songs that simply expressed a woman's right to desire and control her own body were deemed too explicit for the airwaves. They banned her tracks. They refused to play her records. But this censorship was not entirely about the lyrics. It was about the power dynamic she represented. The patriarchal structure of the music industry was willing to sell female sexuality, but only if it was packaged, controlled, and profited upon by men. Betty Davis was selling her own sexuality on her own terms and taking all the credit. She was uncontrollable, and to the corporate machinery, an uncontrollable artist is a dangerous precedent that must be crushed. Yet the boycott did not just come from the white corporate establishment. The most devastating betrayal, the complicity that truly broke the momentum of her career, came from within her own community. In the mid-1970s, organizations like the NAACP and various conservative black leadership groups were heavily invested in the politics of respectability. They were fighting a desperate battle for civil rights and societal acceptance in a deeply racist America. Their strategy was to present black Americans, and particularly black women, as dignified, church-going, morally unimpeachable citizens. They wanted the polished grace of Motown. They wanted artists who wore evening gowns and sang about universal love. When Betty Davis hit the stage, she shattered that fragile narrative. Her live performances were unprecedented displays of raw, unbridled energy. She wore metallic corsets, threw her microphone stand across the stage, and moved with a ferocious, unrestrained sensuality. She was not asking for societal acceptance. She was demanding the right to exist in all her complex, messy, hypersexual reality. The conservative black establishment viewed her as a severe threat to their political goals. They labeled her a disgrace. The NAACP actually organized protests outside of her concerts, pressuring local promoters to cancel her shows. Black-owned radio stations, terrified of alienating their advertisers and civil rights leaders, joined the white stations in the boycott. This is the ultimate tragedy of her solo career, the agonizing intersection of racism and misogyny. White America rejected her because she was too loud, too black, and too rock and roll. Black America rejected her because she was too sexually liberated and refused to adhere to the rigid, polite boundaries of respectability. She was caught in a massive cultural crossfire, standing entirely alone in the center, refusing to change a single note to appease either side. She was being systematically punished for possessing the exact same rebellious, boundary-pushing spirit that the world so desperately praised in male artists like Mick Jagger, James Brown, or her ex-husband. The industry celebrated the eccentricities and the hypersexuality of men, viewing it as the natural byproduct of genius. But when a woman adopted the exact same posture, she was subjected to a coordinated campaign of cultural starvation. Despite the suffocating pressure of the boycott, Betty Davis refused to surrender. In 1974, she released her second album, They Say I'm Different, entirely self-produced once again. The title track was a brilliant, defiant history lesson wrapped in a heavy funk groove. She sang about her deep roots in the blues, referencing Lightnin' Hopkins, John Lee Hooker, and Bessie Smith, proving to the critics that her music was not a superficial gimmick, but a direct continuation of the deepest, rawest traditions of Black American music. She was essentially telling the industry that she knew exactly where she came from, and she did not need their permission to evolve the art form. The album featured some of the most complex, rhythmically sophisticated arrangements of the decade. Tracks like He Was a Big Freak were lyrical masterclasses in psychological domination, turning the tables on the men who had tried to control her. But artistic brilliance without institutional support is a lonely, exhausting battle. The albums were critically acclaimed by the underground press and worshipped by a small, fiercely loyal cult following. But without radio play, without the backing of major promotional campaigns, and with her live shows constantly under threat of cancellation by conservative protests, the financial reality began to close in around her. By 1975, the independent Just Sunshine label could no longer sustain the battle against the industry-wide blackout. Betty signed with Island Records, a larger label that had successfully broken Bob Marley to the mainstream. They released her third album, Nasty Gal. It was a masterpiece of aggressive funk rock, perhaps her most cohesive and powerful statement yet. But the relationship with Island quickly deteriorated, exposing the final layer of corporate complicity. The executives at Island looked at her sales numbers, looked at the radio bans, and delivered the ultimate ultimatum. They told her that if she wanted to survive, she had to tone it down. They wanted her to hire outside producers. They wanted her to record softer, more melodic soul tracks. They wanted to take the wild, feral queen of funk and force her into the mold of a conventional pop singer. They were offering her a choice between her artistic soul and a paycheck. They believed that the years of boycotts, the financial strain, and the relentless public criticism would have finally broken her spirit. They thought they could finally tame her. This is the moment that defines the true philosophical core of her story. In the face of eviction, in the face of absolute industry rejection, and facing the terrifying prospect of total obscurity, Betty Davis looked at the executives and refused. She would not let a room full of suits rewrite her identity. She had already survived a marriage to a man who tried to beat her into submission and steal her cultural legacy. She was not about to let a record label finish the job. She understood deeply that if she allowed them to soften her sound, to clean up her lyrics, and to direct her performances, she would be committing artistic suicide. She would become complicit in her own erasure. Her refusal was absolute. She packed up her master tapes, walked out of the corporate offices, and never released another album in her lifetime. The industry, frustrated by her magnificent stubbornness, simply closed the vault doors. They cut her tour support, dropped her from the label, and essentially blacklisted her from the commercial recording world. The system had successfully executed its campaign. They could not control her, so they deleted her from the mainstream consciousness. By the late 1970s, the woman who had invented the aesthetic of jazz fusion and laid the blueprint for modern funk had completely vanished from the public eye, embarking on a silent exile that would last for nearly half a century. When the vault doors of the music industry finally slammed shut on Betty Davis in the late 1970s, the silence that followed was not accidental. It was carefully orchestrated. She did not fade away naturally. She was actively starved of oxygen by a corporate machinery that found her existence entirely too threatening to the established order. The executives at Island Records and the remnants of the Columbia machine breathed a collective sigh of relief. They had successfully neutralized a rebel. With her master tapes shelved and her touring contracts dissolved, Betty made a choice that still confounds music historians who view fame as the ultimate human achievement. She did not beg. She did not compromise her aesthetic to crawl back into the good graces of the men who controlled the airwaves. Instead, she packed up her life, turned her back on the neon-lit epicenters of New York and Los Angeles, and disappeared. She spent a brief period in Japan, seeking an audience that might judge her solely on the merit of her heavy funk, rather than the racial and gendered politics of America. But the gravitational pull of true isolation eventually brought her back to her roots. She relocated to Homestead, Pennsylvania. Homestead was a quiet, working-class Rust Belt town. It was a place defined by shuttered steel mills and fading industrial glory. It was the absolute antithesis of the glittering, manicured world of the commercial music industry. To the executives in their high-rise boardrooms, this retreat looked like the ultimate defeat. They believed they had broken her. They believed that by cutting off her capital and her platform, they had forced her into a humiliating exile. But this is where the prosecution must fundamentally correct the historical record. The industry did not exile Betty Davis. She exiled them. Her retreat to Homestead was not a surrender. It was an act of profound, impenetrable sovereignty. We are conditioned by a capitalist culture to believe that if an artist is not actively selling records, generating wealth for a corporation, and standing in the spotlight, they have failed. The system demands constant visibility as proof of worth. Betty Davis rejected this entire premise. She understood a fundamental philosophical truth that the men in suits could never comprehend. True artistic integrity sometimes requires absolute silence. She looked at the compromises required to remain in the industry. She saw the demands to soften her lyrics, dilute her heavy bass lines, and defer to male producers. She realized that participating in that system was a form of spiritual death. By walking away, she preserved the purity of her work. Her 3 solo albums remained exactly as she intended them. They were raw, aggressive, unapologetic, and completely untamed. She built a fortress around her identity that the record labels could never breach. In the quiet streets of Homestead, she lived a life entirely devoid of the toxic, sycophantic machinery that had nearly destroyed her during her marriage. She found peace in obscurity. This was a peace that was entirely unavailable to the man she left behind. While Betty was securing her psychological freedom in Pennsylvania, Miles Davis was entering the darkest, most destructive phase of his life. He was fully insulated by the wealth and complicity of the Columbia Records empire. The late 1970s saw the undisputed king of jazz descend into a terrifying spiral of physical and mental deterioration. The genius that the label had fought so hard to protect was rotting from the inside out. He stopped recording. He stopped performing. He barricaded himself inside his Manhattan townhouse, the very same walls that had witnessed his violent outbursts against Betty years earlier. He became consumed by severe substance abuse, paranoia, and physical decay. Yet observe how the corporate system responded to the collapse of their primary asset. They did not drop him from the label. They did not orchestrate a media blackout. They did not demand that he change his fundamental nature to appease their shareholders. Instead, they kept him on the payroll. They advanced him hundreds of thousands of dollars to maintain his lavish lifestyle while he produced absolutely nothing. The industry that had callously discarded Betty Davis for refusing to hire a pop producer spent half a decade and a fortune actively enabling the self-destruction of her abuser. The complicity reached its absolute zenith in the early 1980s when Columbia Records decided it was time to resurrect their king. They needed to recoup their investments. They engineered one of the most heavily sanitized comeback narratives in the history of modern media. When Miles Davis finally emerged from his self-imposed exile and released the album The Man with the Horn in 1981, the global press apparatus went into overdrive. Journalists, critics, and executives fell over themselves to welcome him back. He was booked as the triumphant headliner at the Newport Jazz Festival. They framed his dark years, not as a period of toxic collapse, but as the necessary tragic hibernation of a tortured genius. They romanticized his pain, and in the process of rebuilding his monument, they finalized the erasure of Betty Davis. As the 1980s progressed, a slew of retrospectives, documentaries, and definitive biographies about the creation of Bitches Brew and the electric jazz movement were produced. In almost every single one of these official historical documents, Betty's role was actively suppressed. She was either entirely omitted or reduced to a passing, dismissive sentence about a temporary girlfriend who happened to like rock music. The industry systematically rewrote the history of its most profitable revolution. They cemented the myth that Miles Davis possessed a solitary divine intuition that allowed him to see the future of music. They completely buried the fact that the future was literally handed to him by the young black woman he had beaten and driven away. The institutional memory of the music business operated with the ruthless efficiency of a crime syndicate cleaning up a crime scene. They wiped the fingerprints of Betty Davis off the greatest jazz record of the 20th century and locked the narrative vault. This brings us to the ultimate sickening contrast of their final years. This contrast serves as the closing argument against the music industry's moral bankruptcy. In 1991, Miles Davis passed away at the age of 65. The reaction was a globally coordinated display of institutional reverence. The President of the United States offered public condolences. The Grammy Awards immediately began organizing massive tribute segments. He was eulogized in every major newspaper on the planet as an untouchable deity of American culture. The dark stains of his personal life were politely ignored. His admitted history of severe domestic violence and his predatory extraction of other people's intellectual property were swept under the rug. Biographers argued that his musical contributions outweighed his human collateral. The corporate machinery successfully carried his sanitized myth across the finish line. He died entirely wrapped in the protective armor of the system that had monetized him. Meanwhile, Betty Davis continued her quiet, unseen existence in Homestead. She did not grant interviews to defend her legacy. She did not write tell-all memoirs to cash in on her association with the Jazz King. She lived in a modest apartment, blending in with the local community. She was known to her neighbors simply as a polite, private, elderly woman, rather than the architect of a musical revolution. For decades, it seemed as though the industry's campaign of erasure had been flawlessly executed. The executives bet that if they ignored her long enough, the world would simply forget she ever existed. But the men in the boardrooms made a fatal miscalculation. They controlled the radio stations, they controlled the record stores, and they controlled the mainstream press. But they did not control the underground. They did not control the crates of dusty vinyl, where the absolute truth was waiting to be discovered by a new generation of sonic architects. The vindication of Betty Davis did not come from the establishment. It came from the artists. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, while the mainstream had forgotten her, a quiet revolution was brewing in the studios of the most innovative musicians in the world. A young artist from Minneapolis named Prince found her records. He listened to the raw, aggressive, heavily synthesized funk of her solo albums. He studied her unapologetic fusion of rock guitars and deep bass lines. He absorbed her blueprint for projecting absolute, terrifying sexual dominance on stage. Prince built an entire empire on the exact sonic and visual foundation that Betty Davis had been crucified for laying down a decade earlier. He recognized her genius when the corporate suits were too blinded by their own prejudice to see it. He adopted her vocal squeals, her metallic wardrobe, and her absolute refusal to let a genre define him. The influence did not stop with Prince. As hip-hop emerged as the dominant cultural force, producers digging for the heaviest, most unbreakable beats discovered her 3 solo albums. Her voice and her rhythm sections began appearing as samples in tracks by artists who demanded the same uncompromising grit. Rappers like Ice Cube and Talib Kweli utilized the heavy breaks she had produced to anchor their own narratives of urban rebellion. When the neo-soul movement arrived, brilliant, boundary-pushing women like Erykah Badu and Janelle Monáe explicitly cited Betty Davis as their spiritual predecessor. They looked at her album covers, they listened to her feral vocal delivery, and they realized a profound truth. The doors they were currently walking through had been violently kicked open by a woman who was never allowed to step inside the room. The industry had tried to bury a seed, completely unaware that they were planting a forest. Her music operated like a time bomb. It ticked quietly in the underground for decades until it finally detonated, fundamentally shaping the trajectory of modern pop, funk, and rhythm and blues. The executives who dropped her from their labels were eventually replaced, their names forgotten by history, but the music Betty Davis created remained indestructible. Her refusal to be tamed became the ultimate template for artistic survival. She proved that while a corporation can control distribution, it cannot control the visceral, physical reaction a human being has when they hear a pure, uncorrupted bass line. In the final years of her life, the world slowly began to realize the magnitude of its error. Independent documentary filmmakers and dedicated music historians began tracking her down. They attempted to piece together the shattered fragments of her legacy. In 2017, a documentary titled Betty, They Say I'm Different was finally released. It was a massive step toward historical correction, funded not by major studios but by fans and independent creators who recognized the injustice of her erasure. But even in this moment of long overdue recognition, Betty maintained her fierce, unyielding sovereignty. She agreed to participate in the documentary. She offered her voice to finally tell her own story on her own terms, but she flatly refused to be filmed on camera. She would not allow the modern media apparatus to consume her physical image. She dictated the exact terms of her own unearthing. She proved one final time that she belonged to no one but herself. She was not a tragic victim seeking the delayed approval of the masses. She was a sovereign entity who had already won the war on her own terms 40 years earlier. When Betty Davis passed away in 2022 at the age of 77, the news trickled out slowly. There was no state funeral. There were no massive corporate tributes organized by the major labels. The television networks did not interrupt their broadcasts, but the artists knew, the cultural underground knew. The people who actually write the future of music paused to honor the Queen who had given them their language. The silence surrounding her death was not a sign of irrelevance. It was the final testament to her independence. She died as she had lived since 1976, completely unbothered by the opinions of the music industry. We return now to the paradox that opened this investigation. How do we reconcile the brilliant lights illuminating the statue of Miles Davis with the deep, quiet shadows that surrounded the life of Betty Davis? The answer lies in the cold, calculated complicity of the machine that built them. Columbia Records and the broader music establishment were never in the business of documenting truth. They were in the business of manufacturing profitable gods. They looked at Miles Davis and saw a king whose flaws needed to be violently defended to protect the bottom line. They saw a man whose insecurities could be massaged and whose violence could be ignored as long as he continued to sell out arenas. They looked at Betty Davis, saw a brilliant, uncontrollable woman who demanded equal footing, and realized she was a threat to the entire patriarchal structure of their industry. They chose to protect the abuser and erase the architect. This complicity is not just a historical artifact of the 1970s. It is a terrifying reflection of how cultural power still operates today. The machinery will always favor the profitable myth over the uncomfortable truth. It will always prioritize the comfort of the established genius over the safety and recognition of the marginalized creators who fuel them. But history is longer than a corporate quarterly report. The labels may have stolen her credit for the birth of jazz fusion. They may have turned a blind eye while she was physically battered in her own home. They may have colluded to ban her records and force her into financial ruin, but they could never touch her actual art. The heavy, metallic, relentless groove of her bass lines survived the blackout. Her ferocious, unapologetic demand for independence outlived the executives who tried to silence her. Miles Davis holds the official title of the genius who changed music, but Betty Davis holds the ultimate truth. She was the spark that ignited his revolution, and she was the fire that the industry could never quite extinguish. She walked away with her soul entirely intact. She left behind a legacy that proves the most powerful act of rebellion is refusing to let the system decide who you are. The industry manufactured a god to hide their own sins, but they could not erase the architect. The stolen queen has finally reclaimed her crown. A forensic autopsy of Miles Davis's artistic output in the years following his separation from Betty exposes the absolute magnitude of the industry's crime. The prosecution demands that we look past the blinding glare of the Grammy Awards and examine the actual sonic evidence of the 1980s, when Columbia Records orchestrated his massive, heavily funded comeback. They presented a man who was allegedly still the vanguard of musical innovation. But listen closely to the records he produced during this final decade of his life. The raw, terrifying, dangerous edge that defined the Bitches Brew era had completely evaporated. Without Betty Davis to act as his cultural compass, without her to physically drag him into the underground and force him to confront the bleeding edge of the youth movement, Miles Davis regressed. He was no longer inventing the future, he was merely chasing it. He began recording instrumental covers of contemporary pop songs, most notably Cyndi Lauper's Time After Time and Michael Jackson's Human Nature. While these recordings were commercially successful and politely praised by the establishment critics, they were fundamentally safe. They were the sound of an aging king playing catching up with a culture that had long since passed him by. The blistering, distorted, aggressive funk that Betty had injected into his veins was gone, replaced by a sanitized, highly polished synthesizer sheen that offended absolutely no one. This sonic decline is the ultimate undeniable proof of the prosecution's central thesis. The genius of his electric period was not a solitary phenomenon. It was a collaborative alchemy, and Betty Davis was the active, indispensable catalyst. The moment he drove her away with his violence, he lost his connection to the underground. The industry spent millions trying to obscure this fact, aggressively marketing his later pop covers as visionary statements. But the music itself tells the unforgiving truth. He was a brilliant trumpet player, but without Betty, he was no longer a revolutionary. The mechanics of the blacklist that destroyed Betty's solo career were meticulously designed to look like organic failure. The industry relies on the public believing that her commercial collapse was simply a matter of audience rejection. The executives want you to believe that Betty Davis disappeared because the public simply did not want to buy her records. This is a deliberate, calculated lie. The public was never given the opportunity to decide. The suppression of Betty Davis in the mid-1970s was an active, coordinated campaign of corporate strangulation. In an era before the internet, before independent artists could distribute their own music directly to the masses, the record labels and the radio syndicates held absolute dictatorial control over what the American public was allowed to hear. When Island Records and the independent distributors realized that Betty would not submit to their creative control, they did not just drop her from their rosters. They actively buried the physical media. They halted the pressing of her vinyl. They pulled their promotional budgets entirely. But the most insidious weapon used against her was the network of radio programmers. In the 1970s, radio play was the only oxygen a musician had. The executives at the major labels made phone calls to the powerful syndicates that controlled urban and rock radio stations. They framed Betty not as an innovator, but as a liability. They weaponized the deeply entrenched racial and gender biases of the era. To the white rock stations, she was deemed too aggressive, lacking the safe melodic structure they expected from black artists. To the black radio stations, the executives capitalized on the conservative backlash from organizations like the NAACP. They branded her music as obscene, using her unapologetic sexuality as a smokescreen to hide their true motive, the punishment of an uncontrollable woman. This was not a passive failure. It was a targeted assassination of a career. When a DJ at a local station attempted to play a track from Nasty Gal, they were met with immediate threats of pulled advertising revenue from the parent companies. The industry created a total vacuum around her, starving her of the capital required to book tours, pay session musicians, and maintain her livelihood. They financially bled her out until the only logical option for her physical and psychological survival was to retreat. Yet even as they starved her, the industry continued to cannibalize her innovations. The session musicians who played on her 3 solo albums, men who were veterans of the toughest, most demanding studios in the country, carried the blueprint of her heavy funk back into the mainstream. You can trace the exact rhythmic architecture that Betty demanded in her sessions directly into the massive commercial funk hits of the late 1970s and early 1980s. She taught the industry how to synchronize the aggressive attack of rock guitar with the deep syncopated pocket of soul bass lines. She pioneered a vocal style that abandoned traditional melody in favor of rhythmic, percussive shrieks and growls. But because she held the copyright to her own masters and fiercely protected her publishing rights, the major labels could not directly profit from her back catalog. So they simply hired other, more compliant artists to mimic her style. They sanitized her feral energy, polished the rough edges, and sold the exact same aesthetic to the masses, generating millions of dollars while the original architect was living in a fading steel town in Pennsylvania, unable to secure a record deal. This is the ultimate parasitic nature of the corporate music machine. They will destroy the creator while systematically strip mining the creation. The psychological toll of this systemic theft is unimaginable. Surviving the next 4 decades under the weight of this systemic theft required immense mental fortitude from Betty Davis. Imagine sitting in a modest apartment in Homestead, turning on the television or the radio and constantly witnessing the ghosts of your own stolen genius. She watched the music industry build a fortress of wealth and adoration around the man who physically abused her, crediting him entirely for the aesthetic revolution she orchestrated in his own living room. She watched a new generation of pop stars, women who were praised for their bravery, their sexual liberation, and their genre-bending music, walk through doors that she had violently kicked off the hinges, often without any knowledge of whose shoulders they were standing on. The sheer weight of that injustice, the daily friction of living in a world that has actively conspired to forget your name, is enough to break the human psyche. Many artists who experience a fraction of this exploitation succumb to substance abuse, bitterness, or highly publicized tragic breakdowns. The media secretly hopes for these breakdowns. It allows them to write off the exploited artist as a crazy, tragic figure, thereby absolving the industry of its complicity. But Betty Davis denied them that satisfaction. She refused to play the role of the broken victim. Her silence was not the silence of the defeated. It was the impenetrable armor of a woman who had completely detached her self-worth from the toxic validation of the music industry. She found solace in the quiet dignity of her daily life in Homestead. She became a devout practitioner of Nichiren Buddhism, chanting daily, finding a spiritual center that the executives in Manhattan could never touch, buy, or corrupt. She maintained her physical health, she maintained her sharp, brilliant intellect, and she maintained an absolute, terrifying grip on the truth of what she had accomplished. The industry had taken her money, her platform, and her public credit, but they never managed to take her mind. This is the profound philosophical victory at the core of her story. In a capitalist system that equates visibility with existence, choosing to be invisible on your own terms is the ultimate act of rebellion. The hypocrisy of the music industry was exposed entirely in the late 2000s, when a new phenomenon occurred, the gentrification of the Betty Davis legacy. As the internet democratized access to rare music, younger generations of musicians, producers, and crate diggers began to uncover her 3 forgotten solo albums. The raw, unfiltered power of her music bypassed the traditional gatekeepers and struck a nerve with a modern audience desperate for authenticity. Suddenly, it became culturally fashionable to know who Betty Davis was. Boutique reissue labels, specifically Light in the Attic Records, recognized the immense historical and cultural value of her work and approached her to finally remaster and re-release her catalog. This is where the story takes its final revealing turn. The mainstream industry, the massive conglomerates that had swallowed up the remnants of Columbia and Island Records, suddenly realized that the woman they had discarded was now considered a cult icon. They attempted to co-opt the narrative. Mainstream publications that had ignored her existence for 40 years suddenly began publishing glowing retrospective articles, branding her as a feminist pioneer and a visionary ahead of her time. The prosecution submits this sudden reversal as the final piece of evidence of the industry's absolute moral bankruptcy. They did not apologize for the blacklist. They did not offer financial reparations for the decades of lost royalties. They simply tried to retroactively claim credit for her brilliance now that it was safe and profitable to do so. They attempted to repackage the trauma and the abuse she suffered into a digestible marketing campaign to sell high-fidelity vinyl reissues to affluent record collectors. But Betty Davis, even in her 70s, remained entirely immune to their corporate maneuvering. When the reissue label contacted her, she did not react with desperate gratitude. She reacted as the sharp, uncompromising businesswoman she had always been. She negotiated fiercely. She demanded her rightful royalties. She ensured that she maintained total control over how her music was presented. And most importantly, she refused to allow the industry to consume her physical image. When the journalists came knocking, demanding interviews to fuel their retrospective articles, she largely ignored them. When documentary crews offered to point high-definition cameras at her face to capture the tragic reality of her aging, she shut the door. She would speak on the phone to a select few trusted researchers, her voice still carrying the sharp, witty, and unapologetic cadence of the woman who had stared down the most powerful men in the 1970s music business. But she refused to be put back on display. She understood that the modern media apparatus did not want to honor her. They wanted to consume her. They wanted to turn her painful history into content. By refusing to be seen, she denied them the final victory. She forced the world to engage with her entirely on her own terms. Through the uncorrupted, terrifying power of the music she recorded in 1973. The story of Miles Davis and Betty Davis is not a simple tragedy of a failed marriage. It is a sprawling, devastating indictment of how cultural history is manufactured by the powerful to protect their investments. Columbia Records and the broader institutional framework of the 20th century music business operated as an active accomplice in the erasure of a genius. They looked at a brilliant, young, fiercely independent black woman and decided she was a threat to the patriarchal myth of the solitary male creator. They watched her orchestrate the greatest aesthetic pivot in the history of jazz, and they stole the credit to protect the fragile ego of their aging king. They turned a blind eye to domestic violence because the perpetrator was generating millions of dollars in revenue. And when the victim dared to stand on her own, producing music that challenged every conservative boundary of the era, they colluded to starve her into submission. They thought they had won. They thought that by writing her out of the official biographies, by pulling her records from the shelves, and by crowning her abuser as an untouchable god, they had permanently altered the truth. But the truth, especially when it is recorded on heavy magnetic tape, has a terrifying way of surviving. The bass lines she engineered were too heavy to be buried. The vocal shrieks she unleashed were too piercing to be silenced. The legacy of Betty Davis bypassed the boardrooms, bypassed the radio syndicates, and bypassed the sanitized history books. It traveled directly from the grooves of her vinyl into the bloodstreams of the most important artists of the next half-century. In September 1991, Miles Davis passed away at the age of 65. He was mourned globally as an untouchable musical deity. The industry successfully protected his sanitized myth to the very end. Decades later, on February 9, 2022, Betty Davis passed away quietly in Homestead, Pennsylvania. She was 77. There was no state funeral. There were no corporate tributes. Yet her vindication had already arrived long before her death. A new generation of artists, from Prince to Erykah Badu, had unearthed her records. They studied her heavily syncopated, unapologetic funk and built empires on the blueprint she left behind. The corporate machine manufactured a god and attempted to erase his architect. But history, especially when recorded on heavy magnetic tape, has a way of surviving. Betty Davis never compromised. She walked away from the industry and proved that true immortality never requires the establishment's permission.